This episode is brought to you by Paycor, the HR and payroll software made for leaders. It's never been harder to recruit, hire, and engage workers. That's why HR leaders and frontline managers depend on Paycor for all things people management, from onboarding and performance reviews to compensation and benefits. Learn more at paycor.com/leaders.
Welcome to the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borganoni and Matthew Betz.
Welcome in. Friday, August 25th. It's the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Borganoni, and I am joined, as always, by Matthew Corey Davis Killed Him Betz.
Oh, man. A double whammy this week, dude. We had the Corey Davis situation, which, look, I don't think Corey Davis is incredible at football, but I thought he was a pretty good round 19, round 20 pick on DraftKings. Looks like those lineups are getting a 0, so whoops on that. And Trey Lance. Is it over, Kyle? I mean, is it time to officially retire Trey Lance and the saga that has gone on for 2 years?
He's retired my bank account, if that's really what you're asking. That's been well documented on this show, and it was right there for the 49ers to take Justin Fields, right? Like it was right there if you've been following with us. Like when we were doing our NFL draft props that year, I mean, we felt so good. Things were moving in the right direction with Justin Fields. What do we know, though? And what does the NFL know? We don't know anything. Guys, let's be honest. We're playing fake football. We're talking about it, and we have some information. So if anyone says I got this right, like, no, there's tons of things. The NFL gets hundreds and hundreds of things wrong. Organizations that are worth billions said, let's trade our franchise for Trey Lance and, Zach Wilson. Like, it's pretty normal for teams to actually get things wrong. So maybe we need to give ourselves grace when Corey Davis doesn't work out in round 18.
Okay, that's fair. But yeah, man, that whole situation, like I would love like 10 years from now, something like that. We get a nice little 30 for 30 or something on what went down and the truth of like, did they actually want Mac Jones? Did they really want Trey Lance? Like, where's the truth here? So, fascinating situation, but turns out it doesn't matter, Kyle. You just take Brock Purdy in the last round of the NFL draft, and you've got your franchise quarterback. So, no big deal. No,
that's the best part is that you can kind of like stumble and bumble Chris Berman your way into a starting quarterback.
That's a throwback right there.
I had to. Man, I need a Chris Berman drop on here. He's that would be perfect for the show. On this show, we will be talking about GPP strategies, talking about tournaments. How do you take down a tournament in DFS? I think these shows that we do before the season are building blocks for people to be able to say, hey, how do I have a good process? What are some of these simple things I have to get right? And that's one of the things I think I'll say 5 times on the show. There's a couple of things you need to do to start. And then there is a ton of luck involved of just variance, the roster percentages, the football bounced the right way. You get Mac Hollins for a touchdown in the very last second of a game, and you can win a GPP. So we're trying to get everyone prepared and give you the tools you need. And we think the best place to do that is in the DFS Pass, which is part of the Ultimate Draft Kit Plus. People are asking me all the time, hey, what if I just want to get the DFS Pass? What if I just want to, buy that? Can I just buy that alone? What kind of advice are we giving people? Because we're kind of giving away free stuff.
I mean, yes, you can technically do that. I believe that goes on sale like right before week 1 of the regular season, so in a few weeks. But it's essentially the same price as the UDK Plus.
It is the same price.
So it actually is the same? That is, we got to talk to corporate on that one. But essentially, you get the DFS Pass for free, or you get the UDK for free, however you want to look at it, when you get the UDK Plus. So, man, can't believe it. We have a huge draft weekend coming up. I've got a big draft coming up. Can't wait to use the UDK for that, and then roll it right into DFS season. So it's going to be a great year, man. I'm super excited.
Yeah, I mean, for my draft, I have a friend's draft coming up this weekend. We're going up to a lake house, and I customize my tiers. I'm showing bets. Not great for audio, but I'm sure
I can confirm per source. We've got. Is this conditionally formatted, Kyle?
It is. It is based on tiers.
Of course it is.
ADP. We have risk ratings, upside meters, and I even get to input my league's keepers, which I'm keeping CeeDee Lamb, which I was happy about, and then we have a lottery, and I'm keeping Ramondre. So I would say that my keepers are like bottom tier in the league, but I got to use the Ultimate Draft Kit to kind of figure out what the rest of the league is going to do. We also have a new optimizer in the DFS Pass, so get all of that. You can use the promo code DFS Pod and get it even cheaper. So this is kind of why I'm telling people, if you're waiting to do the DFS Pass, you could jump in it now, because our optimizer, which will be released soon, we've already got some projected roster percentages for week 1. So you can play around with the optimizer in the next week or so, use the promo code DFS Pod to save a little money, and get access to our season-long player props, which we're going to start off this episode talking about some props.
Prop it like it's hot.
Every week, we get to give our official props in the DFS Pass, but there's some early week 1 props that we're just so excited. We just want to give them out for free. Ones that we like. We're not saying these official, but these are ones that I've already laid. You can get them on Prize Picks or on Underdog. And I'm just going to start off by talking about our boy Lamar. So I'll tell one that I like the over and one that I like the under. And you can disagree with me if you want bets on one of them. But Lamar Jackson's rushing line on Underdog is 55.5 rushing yards. 55.5. I wish it was just that. But so 55.5 rushing yards. And I looked this up. This is kind of part of our process. It's not just, it feels like I know Lamar, he could hit that. We actually look up, based on the situation, the game lines, everything else, and say, okay, over the course of their career, over the last year or two, what have they done in these situations? So the Ravens are favored by a lot. Can you tell me, you can look this up, what the line is. Last time I saw was like over 7 against the Texans. It's 10. Okay. So Lamar Jackson is a double-digit home favorite in week 1 against the Texans. That in itself is probably a good lean, but has Lamar hit this line in his career? So in games where Lamar has had at least 75% of the snaps, so not counting those rookie years with Flacco and injuries, in games where he's hit 75+% of the snaps, he has hit this rushing line 72% of the time. And in the props market, that's a really good line. I mean, that's a really good lean. Usually we would say anything over 60, we're like, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. So Lamar, in 43 career games with that snap, he's done it in 31 of them. So I like the over. Usually we don't like overs at all. We usually lean on the unders, but that one just feels good in week 1.
Yeah, you won't hear me arguing against that one for sure. We talked a lot with Warren Sharp on our show maybe 3 weeks ago, something like that, just about the Ravens and how that 3 wide receiver set new look offense is going to lead to much more scrambling, even if the designed rush attempts aren't there, and the efficiency therefore will be higher. So certainly could see the over hitting there. Again, we're doing this for the show. Kyle asked me to pick an over. I hate playing overs, but if I was going to play one in week 1, the DJ Moore line I think is too low. It's 45.5 receiving yards. And look, his per game averages since 2019 are well above this. 78 yards, 79 yards, 68, 52, even last year in what was a train wreck of a season with quarterback play with Baker Mayfields of the world and PJ Tucker and whoever else was throwing the football. He still was going over this mark. So
PJ Walker. You said PJ Tucker.
What did I say? PJ Tucker?
The basketball.
It sounded so right in my head. I was like, let's roll with it. PJ Walker. Excuse me, Mr. Walker, for mistaking your name. Was even helping him, hit these lines. So I know Justin Fields has his flaws as a passer, but we just got news Cole Kmet got banged up. And look, man, we're 2 weeks out from the season. Cole Kmet's banged up. Chase Claypool's missing practice. Like, someone's catching the football there, and it's DJ Moore. So I think over 45.5 is very much in play.
All right, I'll give you one that I'm under, and it never feels good to give a prop for week 1 in the very first game, because either you look awesome or people are just like, why would you explain that to me? Why would you give that to me? And I have the entire game, I have to take the under and not root for good football in game 1. And even more, I hate that this is on brand. But I think the numbers are stating that it's in the right direction. What do you hate this prop? Before I even say this name,
I don't love it. If I'm being honest, I will not be playing this personally.
Okay, so you're emotionally attached and you can't remove your bias. Gotcha. Wait, but so am I. It's Amon-Ra, which you guys know. Amon-Ra's line on Underdog is 77.5 receiving yards, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in 2 years, okay, so he's 2 years in the league, in road losses, which we project, and they are projected as road underdogs against Kansas City. So 77.5 receiving yards in 2 years in road losses. He has hit the under on this line in 10 of his 12 games. So that's 83% of his games. He has hit the under. And so I don't like rooting for unders. I understand Jameson Williams is gone. So it's not great. But over time, I think it makes sense to take an under on this.
I think a lot of these splits that you referenced comes down to just Jared Goff historically has been much better at home, much better in nice warm weather in a dome. And not that it's going to be cold in September or whatever, but just historically, Goff's numbers at home are much better. And we were playing him a ton in DFS last year when he's like, we're at home. Okay, we're good. If he's on the road, I'm a little worried here. The only reason that I push back a little bit is just because of the fact that, look, I know that they want to lean on the run game, but if Pat Mahomes does what Pat Mahomes does, and the Chiefs have gone over their 30.5 team implied total in 6 straight week 1 games, if I'm not mistaken, with Andy Reid and Pat Mahomes, back and forth there over the years. Like, if they roll, Goff's going to have to put up the football through the air. So that's my only hesitation, which is why I would not be playing it, also because he's the GOAT. But that's just me. That's just my personal take.
Could you see this being one where, like, through 3 quarters, he's at like 40-something yards, and this looks good, and then, the Chiefs are up 32-18 or something, and then in that fourth quarter, you just see Amon-Ra just get like 5 different receptions. That's how it's going to go.
Absolutely could see that. He'll finish with 79 and make your bet miss here. But the under that I like, historically, tight end unders have been a very good bet. I like David Njoku under 37.5 receiving yards. This is a line that he struggled to clear over the last 2 seasons. He's been under in 20 of 30 games, aka 2/3. There is plenty of target competition in Cleveland right now. And we don't know how it's going to shake out, but everything we're hearing out of camp is Elijah Moore, is Donovan Peoples-Jones on the deep ball. Amari Cooper is still there as the one. David Njoku only saw 4.9 targets per game last season and a 65% route rate. Those numbers are going to have to come up for him to consistently be hitting somewhere in the 40-ish range of yardage on a weekly basis. So you take all that into consideration. The other thing is we need Deshaun Watson to play well, and we don't know if he will. The market's assuming he will. It's just unknown, and there's been mixed reviews out of camp. So easy under for me to lean with David Njoku. Like I said, the hit rate on tight end unders on a weekly basis are historically very strong.
So every single week, we do give those props. Betz kind of gets to start the article on Wednesday, and then we add them as we see news, as we see different ones that we find value in, and we get to alert everybody. If you're in our Discord channel, you get an alert that says, hey, take this prop before we move the lines. No big deal. So you can get that at ultimatedraftkit.com and get the DFS pass. But if you're here, you're ready to talk some strategy about GPPs.
You down with GPP?
If you've got a long weekend, just yard work, whatever else you're doing, and you didn't listen to the previous 2 episodes, then you could go back to back to back. And I think that's what a lot of people, maybe if you haven't been listening, I'm just saving that up, that DFS goals episode, who could forget? Or last week, cash game strategy. And this week, GPP strategy. I mean, that is a 3-pack to get people excited for DFS. And if you're not excited about DFS after this, then I don't know what you're doing, right?
We can't help you if that's the case.
The doctor's like, I have nothing for you. You are just bland, boring.
It's over, man.
Got nothing. So Betz and I will discuss some of the game theory, because a tournament and how you take down a tournament is very different than how we discussed cash last week. We even talked about cash contest selection. We'll kind of dabble a little bit, but we're going to do another episode where we focus mostly on roster percentages and how you read those, and also which contest to pick, because I think a lot of people get lost in the mix of Millie Maker and everything else, and they don't know where else to go. But this episode, we're talking mostly about GPPs. Those are called guaranteed prize pools. Usually with the GPP, the payout, the cash is probably going to be somewhere between a third and 25% to even lower, depending on which field you're in. So you're not just trying to hit a median outcome, you're trying to hit a top outcome. We would first say hitting a top 25% outcome, and then even better, a top 5% outcome. To win the Millie Maker, you need greater than a 1%, you need to hit the nuts. And we'll talk about how to do that, because that's the easiest thing to do, is just you get a perfect lineup. And if you get a perfect lineup, you're good, you're set, you're fine. I think you and I have mentioned this before, but I had this kind of daydream the other day of like, if I won the Millie Maker, what would I do? I wonder how often that happens with people when they get in DFS. Like, if I won, here's what I would do. But I've said this to you before. If I win, I will not tell my wife at all, and I will just casually bring it up, probably like before bed. I just want that moment. I almost want to like film it just so I could just see, how she responds.
I thought you were saying you would literally never tell her, and you would just like slowly withdraw the money, so it's not suspicious at all, and just eventually over time you use it all, but she never knows. That would be incredible. But you're talking about like day of, you would just give yourself a few hours to just enjoy it and then tell her after, which is hilarious, because that one playoff weekend that I had, a huge weekend, my wife was like, she's like, I'm going to bed early. I was like, Mom, this is a huge game, like Chiefs, Bills, it's back and forth. So excited. And I'm just on the edge of my seat because I'm having a great DFS slate, but also the game was incredible. And I walk in there, she's dead asleep. I like whisper, I'm like, hey, I won a lot in DFS. She's like, okay, great. Didn't even care. So I respect it.
I know. It would be like just this awesome long con if just slowly, like I just slowly acquire more gold chains. And she's like, where are these coming from?
10 years from now, you look like Kirk Cousins on the plane.
Dude, hey, Kirk can rock that. I respect that. So, yeah, it's fun to be able to do that. But playing tournaments is all about understanding this as a game. Whatever game you're playing, whether it's Battleship. So I play Battleship against my 4-year-old, and we're still working on, like, it's the letters, the numbers. You figure out, where the Battleship should go. There is a game theory portion to Battleship and DFS to say, what is the other person going to do? And I use Battleship because you can't see what the other person is totally doing. They have to place these things on the other side, and you're guessing, but we also can have an educated guess as we move on. So thinking about DFS as game theory, we're trying to find the optimal plays, so the best plays possible, while also weighing out what is the opportunity cost. If I play this player who is, let's just say, popular this week, they're rostered 25%. Okay, if I play this player, what has to happen for them to pay off for this team? Like, do I need 20 plus points? And on a roster to hit 225 points in a GPP, you need everybody to contribute and get at least 20 points. And really, you need the high-end players to get 30 plus. You need your quarterback to go for 35, 40 points. You need to think about all that. So it's about the opportunity cost. It's about the roster percentages. But this is my point I want to hammer home. I said it before. It comes down to me for tournaments. Do you have good correlation and do you have good projections? And luckily, we have those in the DFS pass. Like, it sounds so simple, but if you have really bad projections and you are not trying to correlate, then more often than not, you are just throwing darts, and that will not work. It will work sometimes, but over the course of time, we would say good correlation and good projections will win out. So any thoughts of just like the mental fortitude people need and thinking about this as a game?
I think that's the biggest take home, and I think that's the biggest weakness I see in a lot of GPP players is the struggle to remove your football guy hat when you're setting a GPP lineup, because really you can understand schemes and playing time and whatever. I'm not saying that stuff isn't important, but like that's where we use that information in cash. We play the best plays. In a tournament, you are literally setting yourself up just to have leverage on the field. Smart leverage. I'm not saying you just like, oh, that guy's 1%, he's a great play. If he's running 4 routes a game, he's not a great play. But like, you need to understand you're trying to figure out what happens when certain players fail and how you capitalize. And that's what's really hard for a lot of people is like, it doesn't feel comfortable to not play this guy who's, 20% and projects pretty well. I don't want to give up 3 points of projection. Well, if you're getting 15 points of roster percentage, discount, that's probably worth it, right? Like, so you just need to be mindful that this is more of a game theory aspect. Not saying the football stuff doesn't matter, because it does, but it's way more important to understand, how you win when other players or other, DFS players fail. That's really what it's all about, because you're not going to climb the leaderboard unless you have leverage on the field.
I think a lot of people hear two messages from us, because last week with Cash, we talked about taking a long-term approach and how you can insulate your losses. If you learn the right way, you can win more often than not. Let's say 12 weeks out of 18 on the year, something like that. But for GPP, you're trying to play for just one day. Like, if you have 2 weeks out of 18 that you crush in GPPs, I would say you killed it that year. It just depends on the tournament too. Like, if you do well consistently in small entry like you do, Betz, then, single entry type tournaments, then that's fine. But like in these bigger tournaments, just understand that you're playing for just one thing. So maybe explain how we approach who is playing with us, because that's the only thing that really changes. We're going from playing against one person in head-to-heads or half the field to a much bigger group.
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of what I was referencing just a couple of minutes ago is the fact that, you need to be understanding what your opponents are going to do, so that, and that's what roster percentages are all about, so that when the field size is larger, when you're playing against a lot of people, understanding what those people are going to do helps you understand how things could go wrong and how you could benefit from the situation. So the goal is not about, avoiding mistakes or trying to, quote, play the best play every time. It's about understanding a range of outcomes, understanding that you need way more variance. You need calculated risk. I want to say risk, but like smart. Calculated risk, embrace volatility, because that's what you need in these tournaments. And the tricky part about that is that you could embrace those things, play the right, plays from a process standpoint. Of course, results oriented is not the best way to look at it. From a process standpoint, and still have like 6 weeks in a row where you're just getting crushed and you're putting up zeros. But that's sometimes the life of a GPP player. But then on the 7th or 8th week, you take it down and all of a sudden your entire season is made. So there's way more ups and downs, from a bankroll management standpoint, from a mental health standpoint for a lot of people. Like, that's kind of tough to deal with sometimes, but that is the nature of these tournaments, is that they are top heavy. And in order to get to the top of the leaderboard, you do have to embrace that variance and that volatility.
Do you think that there's a difference between who is playing in tournaments, big tournaments like the Millie Maker, the first month of the season, so week 1 all the way up, into October, as opposed to later on in the year? Because we say all the time that there is a drop-off in DFS. There's a drop-off in fantasy football, probably in your home league, of people that are playing. They get to week 9, they're like, I'm not really making it. And so they just kind of tail off. In DFS, you see the same thing. The tournaments aren't nearly as big because people haven't learned how to play cash the right way. They don't have the bankroll for it. So it's tough, because I've heard people ask before, like, oh, does, all the casuals leave, and does it get harder or worse? Like, there is an element where I think taking it down in GPP in week 12 or 13 is really hard, because the people staying with it have gotten sharper. We understand the better teams. Like, week 1 is so fun because everyone comes in with their preconceived notions. You have a lot more casual people that say, sweet, I can pay $5 to get in the Millie Maker. I'll throw in, 5 lineups and see what happens. And you look back and you're like, oh man, you can do so many different things in week 1. So for me, I like going in a little bit more because I think there's more casual people, but I also recognize there's a lot I don't understand about the NFL that I've assumed over the summer.
Right. And in week 1, we don't know anything. I mean, we'll know some stuff, but like, there's going to be a lot of unknowns that in week 2, week 3, we're like, okay, that's how they view this running back, or that's how they view this wide receiver from a playing time standpoint. We were drafting him in the 9th round. That was silly, right? Stuff like that happens all the time. And so, yeah, as the course of the season goes on, you learn more information, and so does the field, and it gets, I think, tougher. So yeah, I think in weeks, 1, 2, 3, like the first month of the season, there is not only some more casual people playing, but also we can take advantage of, the field being way too overconfident in what is going to happen with a certain player or a team. And, that's where I think the leverage really comes in. So I actually the way I kind of approach it, I'm not a large field GPP player mostly, but I will play some more in weeks 1, 2, and 3 just because, like I said, there's way more unknowns. And if you can see what the field is going to do because they think they know what's going to happen and the opposite comes true, you can really create a ton of leverage and have some success.
Yeah, like week 1 last year, Saquon Barkley was the RB1, but there was still a question, like, is he back? Like, is he still elite anymore? And when you looked at it, he was cheap. He was 6,100 on DraftKings, but the field wasn't like over the moon. He was only 14% in the Millie Maker. So there's so many assumptions that people have in week 1, and you can kind of go all in. I remember a couple years ago, it was like, okay, the Ravens, just jump on board Lamar. And that was, a week 1 where he just went bananas. I think it was against the Dolphins. Marquise Hollywood-Brown had a long touchdown. It was just one of those things where you want to be ahead of the curve. And right now you can be, just looking at this offense, like Carson Wentz, your boy. I know he's like probably, I don't know, one of your favorite players of all time. He was the QB3 last year in week 1. It was that Washington-Jacksonville game that was pretty back and forth. Washington won. But those are the kind of things that in week 1 you can kind of jump on and figure out. So we'll talk more in just a second about last year's Millie Makers, but we're going to take a break.
This episode is brought to you by Paycor. Paycor empowers leaders to build winning teams. With Paycor, leaders can recruit, onboard and train employees, set goals, and drive performance. If you're a leader, everyone depends on you. Who do leaders depend on? Paycor. Learn more at paycor.com/leaders.
The summer event Ahsoka is now streaming on Disney+. Witness the thrilling adventure of former Jedi Knight Ahsoka Tano as she uncovers a disturbing new threat to the galaxy far, far away. Don't miss the highly anticipated Star Wars series Ahsoka, now streaming only on Disney+.
So you and I did some digging along with our friends that helped us with our optimizer DFS forecast. So that optimizer and the tutorial video will be out there that you can kind of see. But we did some digging based on last year's Millie Makers and what makes a good tournament lineup. And every week on the podcast, we get to talk about stacking options. And to kind of introduce this part, I'm going to bring back an old drop.
Stack Attack.
Yeah. The people love it. They like a good drop. So stacking. I'm going to let you start off this conversation, and then we'll kind of bring it back to what worked in Millie Makers. So we'll give examples from different weeks and said, hey, this is what the winning lineup had. Here's why it made sense looking back on it. But let's just talk about stacking on a broad sense, and then you and I will talk more about game stacking and bringbacks and all the others. So on a broad sense, tell me why stacking works.
Yeah, so essentially we are looking at kind of what the top 25% of lineups did comparing to those who didn't even hit the cash line. And there's a comparison that you can make that says if a higher rate of teams that are finishing in the top quarter of the field are doing this and people that are losing are not doing this, that's where the edge is. And if you've been playing DFS for a while, stacking is not new to you. If you've been playing best ball, we all know about stacking. And basically, you're just trying to put a quarterback with one of his players, one of his teammates. But ideally, it's a pass catcher. And we'll talk about the running back situation in a minute. But the top 25% of the field in the Millie Maker last year was doing this with at least one teammate at a 94% rate. It's like, okay, yeah, everyone's doing it. But the teams that weren't cashing were only doing it 82.8% of the time. So there is still an edge that like some people entering the Millie Maker across the entire season are not stacking. And again, if you've been listening to the show for years, if you've been playing, you should know that. But like it just shows you that still there is an edge to do it. So no matter what, we want to be playing a quarterback with one of his teammates. And that just comes down to getting less things right. If your quarterback goes off, if he throws a 50-yard bomb and you have his pass catcher, you double dip on the points. So you get less things that you have to get correct. If you just get that right, that's one thing you can check off the box, so to speak. So you definitely want to be stacking, and specifically when you're looking at correlation data, going back to 2017, this is from Fantasy Labs. The wide receiver one, to no surprise, 0.49 correlation Wide receiver 2, 0.42. The tight end also 0.42. So there's not a massive difference in those aspects. So if you're just using the data, I think you feel pretty comfortable stacking with anyone that they're throwing the ball to. Ideally, though, this is where the art comes in. You can understand who makes a good play, where they're priced at, the game environment, which we'll talk about in a second, and then just archetypes, right? Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think. Like Hayden Hurst, if you're stacking up Bryce Young, is Hayden Hurst ever going to give you a winning performance that you need that's just large field, you're taking home all the money? Probably not, right? But like, could DJ Chark catch 2 long bombs in any given week? Potentially, right? So that's where the art comes in to this sort of thing. But basically, the take home is the top million maker lineups are stacking, and even though a lot of people are doing it that lose, not enough are. There's a big enough edge.
Right. And I think sometimes people get cute. The only time we would ever say don't stack your quarterback is if you get somebody who's Justin Fields or Lamar Jackson, and just at the end of the day, they run for 100, so you get the 3-point bonus. They score 1 on the ground. And then also it's possible they just end up spreading out the touchdowns. And, if it's Fields, it's like Mooney got a touchdown, Moore got a touchdown, Kmet got a touchdown. And you might not need any of those in the optimal, but I would say like Kmet could be one of those where it's like, okay, well, tight ends don't score a lot. So if Kelsey's not on the slate, that could be a fine play. But just keep that in mind. You're going to be stacking. You should be stacking. A lot of times, people maybe overdo it to the point of just not realizing it's kind of just simple. Just start that way. You don't have to get too cute. And like we said, it comes down to, do you have good correlation and good projections? So in week 1 last year, the Millie Maker lineup had a very simple stack. It was Mahomes and Kelsey, which I remember last year, Kelsey was only 6,600 in week 1. And we said he's a great play in cash. And it also meant you could play him in tournaments. Now, Mahomes threw 5 touchdowns against the Cardinals because the Cardinals were trash. But also in this lineup, they didn't bring anyone back, which we'll talk about in a second. But like, don't think that every single time you stack, you have to always have somebody on the other side, especially if the other team doesn't have a ton of great plays. So in week 1, Hollywood was a pretty popular play because Hopkins was suspended. And then Rondale Moore, there's just other guys that people went for. And at the end of the day, it was like no one really was important from that Cardinals side. But when I look at this lineup, it was real simple. Did you have a stack? Check. And then from there, this lineup actually wasn't like super special. They only had one person under 5% rostered. It was the Steelers defense, which we're not going to talk anymore about defense, but just throw a dart, get cute. We're fine with defense. You probably don't always have to hit the nuts in defense because there's some weeks where like 16 points will win it for you from a defense. This week it was 26, but anything else you noticed from this week 1 lineup? Because they stacked Mahomes and Kelsey, and then they had some other like simple plays. Michael Pittman was super popular, and we had him in our cash lineups, and then he's here in the Millie Maker.
Yeah, we're going to talk about like roster percentages and sort of kind of what's been shown to be optimal. But the nice thing about this lineup too, and this is really, I think, tough for a lot of people as well, is you think Millie Maker, you think large field tournament, you're like, I got to get unique everywhere. No, you do not. You should not, actually. The best GPP lineups are a combination of these great plays that project super well that will come with some roster percentage. Like that's just the reality. But also mixing in these contrarian pieces. So, like, for example, they had Gibson at 9%. They had Romeo Doubs at 8%. Like you said, the Steelers defense at 3%. Like, they're mixing in a combination of great plays that will be played by the field, but they're great plays for a reason, but also contrarian pieces. And the mix of those two really is how you make a great tournament lineup.
Yeah, and Romeo Doubs scored 8 points for them. So it's not like every single person has flames next to them. Gibson did great, 20 points, but Gibson didn't even score a touchdown. So 251 points is awesome. That's a top 1% outcome. It's insane. But when you look at the lineup and you kind of look back every single week, you can go, wow, that's it's not as crazy as you would think. Talk to me about double stacks, because when you get this right, it is one of the most fun parts of DFS, because you're saying, not only did I have a quarterback and a pass catcher, but I added another one and they both paid off. A lot of times the field will just pick one or the other, like Lockett or Metcalf. And sometimes there are weeks where it is just you need both of them and you need to go bananas. So talk to me about double stacking.
Yeah, so there is still a little bit of an edge in these large field tournaments in double stacking. It's not as big as just straight up stacking. 41% of the top 25% of lineups used a double stack. The ones that missed or didn't cash only did it at about a 37% rate. So it's not a huge difference. And I think the thing with this is we need to be mindful as well about teams, quarterback archetypes specifically. We talk about those Russian quarterbacks. Like if I'm playing Justin Fields and I'm playing DJ Moore, like I'm playing that as those two go off. Like, does he bring Chase Claypool with? Maybe. Does he bring Cole Kmet with? Probably not, right? Like that kind of thing. Like you need to be able to have the art of it to understand that these pocket passers like Trevor Lawrence could throw a couple bombs to Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley. Like he can get there. You can throw 4 touchdown passes. Tom Brady for the last couple of years was doing that. So there are certain quarterbacks and certain teams where you want to do it. There's a little bit of an edge in these large field tournaments, but I don't think, and this is probably contrarian to what a lot of the DFS content in the space has put out there recently. I don't think it's a necessity in these large field tournaments. And that's the take home is like, there's a small edge, but it's not huge. And when you think about it and you just take a step back and you say, okay, there's so many people in this tournament that are playing. I need to get almost every spot perfect. If you are double stacking, there's a chance that you're taking away some ceiling from someone else who could be in your lineup. So I won't exclude it if I'm playing this stuff, but I'll be mindful about who I do it with and understanding price sensitivity specifically. If you're trying to roster a high-priced quarterback and 2 stud pass catchers like the Lockett Metcalf example, those guys are always in the 6 to 7K plus range. Like they have to do so much to pay it off. If you can find a cheap double stack that doesn't have a lot of salary associated with it, that's viable. But yeah, I think single stacks probably are my preference for the most part in these large field lottos, just because you have to get so much right. We're going to talk about small field strategy later on where I think that's the opposite, but in these GPP large field lottos, I think single stacks are my preference personally.
The best part about double stacks is you get to pull the lever of leverage. I don't even know if that's where I wanted to go with that, but leverage was the word.
Wow. That was something right there, dude.
Dang it. You get to use leverage. And so, for instance, in week 14, Trevor Lawrence was the quarterback in the winning Millie Maker lineup. And his best wide receiver last year, we would say, was Christian Kirk, right? Like he was their top one. And he was actually projected for the most points, and he also had the highest roster percentage, okay? But what the Millie Maker lineup did is they brought Lawrence, and then they used 2 other pieces that not only were cheaper, but much lower rostered. And so I like to look at teams where there are 3 clear pass catchers, okay? And if you're going to double stack, you need to at least have one of them be a leverage piece. So for instance, this lineup was Trevor Lawrence, Zay Jones at 4,700, who would have projected great in cash, I think. But then they had Evan Ingram at 3,300. And you remember that was the week where Evan Ingram just went bonkers. He went 42 points, but he's only rostered by 3.6% of the Millie Maker lineup. So there was leverage on the Christian Kirk lineups. And I'm not saying that you need to just pick the guy who's most popular and fade them. It's like, I think this lineup, if you would have gotten Lawrence, Kirk, and Ingram, that was a good construction. Or, Lawrence, Ingram, and then you pick somebody else, like it's totally possible for that to win. But keep in mind, if you're double stacking those 2 pass catchers, you probably want to, in a big tournament, find one that is the lowest and pair, just so that you can have leverage on the other group in case it doesn't work out. But this lineup was awesome because it had Jerry Jeudy in it, who had 3 touchdowns against the Chiefs.
Just had to bring it up, didn't you?
Dude, that was like one of my favorite weeks because last year, it was just a dumpster fire. And just that week, for some reason, Jerry Jeudy he made my week. I remember I didn't have a great cash week, but in tournaments, I played so much Jerry Jeudy and he caught 3 touchdowns. So, woohoo, go me. Tell me about bringbacks though. So we talked about stacking, we talked about double stacking. Let's say you have a quarterback and you say, hey, I'm going to identify who the pass catcher is. How important is it to have somebody from the opposing team to bring it back with?
Yeah, so again, similar to what I was just talking about with the double stacks, there is an edge, and I think it makes sense to do it when the slate allows for it, meaning there are games that you can see those higher totals, you can see those faster paced teams that love to throw, you can see that game turning into a high scoring environment. And really what that comes down to is if your quarterback and his pass catcher do very well, it's going to push the other team to also have to throw, to score points, to have a good DFS slate, right? So again, you're minimizing the things that you need to get right. If that game goes off, there's a good chance you're going to have the right pieces, or a better chance, I should say, that you have the right pieces than you would otherwise. So that's kind of the take home with the bringbacks. Specifically looking at the style of bringback in this data, it was a quarterback, one pass catcher, and then someone on the other side, an opponent. 46.5% of the top quarter of lineups in the Millie Maker were doing that versus 38% of the teams that were losing. So there is an edge in doing it. And when you're thinking about, okay, well, if there's an edge, I know I probably should do it most weeks. Who do I bring it back with? The opposing wide receiver one, again, this is from Fantasy Labs, correlation is 0.24. The wide receiver, 0.26. The tight end, 0.24. The running back, 0.20. So basically, there's no difference.
Bring it
as
back.
long as you're sensitive to projection, roster percentage, salary, I wouldn't get stuck in the weeds of like, I have to have the wide receiver one. I can never play the running back. Like, this data has shown that it doesn't really matter in a large kind of umbrella, view of everything. You can understand there's certain plays that are better because of how they project and their percentages and salary. But the take home is don't get stuck in the weeds on which player you bring it back from.
I'm looking at the winning lineup from week 10, and it was like in the middle of Justin Fields' fever. All right, so we were playing him in cash. He was 29% in the Millie Maker, which is really high for a quarterback. I mean, that's absurdly high. But when he goes for 43 points, like, he is needed in the lineup. He was still only 6,500, so Justin Fields was an awesome play. He wasn't stacked with anybody, but this person brought back Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then I look at the rest of the lineup. They had Tony Pollard, who was correlated with Christian Watson, who went for 35 points. They have Travis Kelce at tight end, who scored 20 points. Like, he was good. He wasn't like awesome, but they correlated it with Christian Kirk, who went for 34 points. So a lot of times you just have to get a lot less right when you are correlating and just saying, do these games go off? And that's kind of another take home is like, you have to find a game that is going to go off. And by going off, we're saying they're probably going to hit their over under or their team hits their team implied total. Do you think it's easy in a tournament to get a little lost in that? Like, I find that when I look at a lineup and I start building, I start with my quarterback. I have a stack. I usually have a bring back. And then I start looking at the rest of my lineup. Okay, well, there's a running back. It's Tony Pollard. I got to find somebody from that game to also correlate him with. Is that the right strategy of winning over time? Because week to week, you can feel like, man, I kept trying to do the same thing and it didn't work. But over the course of the season, in-game correlation, and we say this all the time, like, nobody correlates better than a person in the same exact game, right? Like, Tony Pollard is not going to correlate with somebody who's not playing in the same game with him as well. It could be that week, but based on the game environment, that's what you want. But sometimes I get so mad because I go with that and then it doesn't work out.
I think it's always slate dependent, which is really tough to, for this show specifically to give like a good answer, but it is slate dependent and it really is like player specific. If you're looking at two options as like, okay, this guy correlates as a bring back, that guy doesn't. Yeah, he's, $300 cheaper, but like you're giving up 10 points of projection. Like that's a ton, right? So like in that situation, I probably wouldn't, but I think I'm using it as tiebreakers and, really for the correlation stuff, like in the best ball streets, like week 17 thing, right? For a couple years was like, well, does it really matter? I don't know. And then like every winner in Best Ball Mania is like, they've got to bring back. And like, that's what you need. You need that back and forth correlation. So that's why people will make fun of it, but really it does help. I mean, like you said, no one correlates better than someone in the same lineup. So I am trying to do it whenever I can, but I'm not going over the top and sacrificing other things in my lineup. The player's ceiling projection, their roster percentage, what do they cost? Like those are all things to consider. So that's where the art comes in with sort of the data. So in short, I'm not forcing it though.
What if I want to stack my quarterback and get real cute and say, hey, nobody else is going to stack them with the running back? Like, what if I was just like, you know what? J.K. Dobbins, Lamar Jackson, week 1, Texans, they're going to roll. They're going to put up 40 points. Thoughts?
Just because we gave that example, they're both going to randomly
I know.
for like 100 yards and 2 touchdowns each. But in general, this is a losing strategy. This is one where the top quarter of lineups are using a quarterback with his running back at just a 5% rate. So it just doesn't work very often. Lineups that are missing the cash line are doing it almost 14% of the time. So again, our opponents are doing it too much in these large field tournaments. We shouldn't be. And when you think about football, like it makes perfect sense. over the course of an entire season, if the Ravens roll and you have Lamar and J.K. Dobbins, they will correlate over over 17 games, over 18 weeks. But in 1 week, if J.K. Dobbins is having a great game, he's running for over 100 yards and he scores 3 touchdowns on the ground, Lamar Jackson is presumably not throwing a bunch of touchdowns unless they score 50-some points, right? So it makes sense when you just think about football and how touchdowns are scored and how points are scored. So again, even though you might have pass-catching running backs that you could see their quarterback throwing them the ball for 6, 7, 8 targets, something like that, just historically it doesn't work out. So I am not trying to stack my quarterback with my running back.
Right. And the point you're trying to make is you said just 5% of the top 25% lineups use that. And it can work. Like I had a week last year where it was Herbert and Eckler, and it was like, this is awesome. They're working together because Eckler is essentially a wide receiver. So it can work. And I get messages from people all the time like, I thought you told me not to stack my running back and my quarterback. And we're saying over the course of the season, it will bear out. Now, week to week, anything can happen. There's so much variance. And there's so much variance in football. So in a job where we talk about projections, people are like, you guys projected him for 15 points and he only went for 8 this week, or he went for 30 this week. It's like, yes, over the course of the season, this will bear out. And it is good projections. And you need to be able to see that way, but things changed. It's week to week. It's crazy. Talk to me about flexing in big tournaments, because we talk a lot about wide receivers in the flex on a full PPR site, and that's where we're going to lean most of the time. But running backs, I feel like, don't get their fair share.
Yes, and that's what the data shows. So the 25% of lineups in the Millie Maker, wide receiver in the flex about 49% of the time, running back about 40%, and this is the take home, tight end 11%, aka don't do it. I mean, most of the time, don't do it. And really, when you think about the redraft ADP lens and best ball, like how you feel about playing, clicking on a tight end, it never feels good. Like these guys just don't have the ceiling that a running back or a wide receiver has. So I generally am not trying to stack up my tight end in the flex. Wide receiver and running back, there's a small edge with running back, actually, which is kind of counterintuitive. This is where it comes down to is it's not bad to use a wide receiver. It's just that losing lineups and those finishing in the top quarter of the field are doing it at about the same rate. So it's still good to do. Just understand a lot of people are still doing it. Running back, however, only 33% of losing lineups are doing it, whereas I said 40% of the top 25% of the field are doing it. So that is where the edge is. Tight ends, our opponents are doing way too much. Almost 19% of the time losing lineups are using a tight end in the flex. And as I said, only 11% for winning lineups. So stay the course, good correlation, good projections. Let other people make the mistake of playing their tight end in a flex.
Yes, and I remember there was a week, it was week 1, it was Darren Waller against the Jets. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before maybe. Darren Waller had like 19 targets. And I just remember people saying like, hey, you told me that tight ends in the flex are a bad idea. Yes, over the course of the season, they will not be great. You just saw one awesome week from Darren Waller. It can work. Like you can have a TJ Hawkinson week, but based on the data Betz just gave, 89% of the time, it's not a good idea to use a tight end in the flex. Okay. Every once in a while in cash, I think you and I will be fine with it. If there's a cheap tight end we like, and there's somebody like Kelsey or Andrews that are projecting almost like a wide receiver and they're not priced up, like in cash, I think I'm okay with that if you wanted to use 2 tight ends, but it's still pretty rare. Last year, just speaking about the flex, week 4 was a week where the Seattle and Detroit game was just bonkers. I mean, 93 combined points. And the lineup is Geno double stacked with Metcalf and Lockett. You had Jamal Williams at running back. You also had TJ Hawkinson. So that game, and Josh Reynolds. So this game was like massively stacked. But the key was actually Josh Jacobs in the flex at only 6% in the afternoon slate, and he went for 37.5 points. So you could have gotten all of those things right and said, I'm going all in on Seattle and Detroit. But what you really needed to understand is in the flex, so many people were going after the wide receiver that Josh Jacobs was the key piece. And Josh Jacobs was kind of like a afternoon hammer in general. And in our optimizer each week, you actually get to see how did people approach the flex. And that week, we actually have the data for it, that the top of the lineups, like 96% of them were using running backs in the flex, but the losing ones were using the wide receivers at 57%. So like the field was overvaluing the wide receivers and undervaluing the running backs to the point of this is how you create separation in your lineup. So you have that in the optimizer each week. You can actually see how is the field in general, how do they use the flex position, and how does this bear out over time? So one of my favorite parts of the tool this year of the optimizer is you can put in all your settings, the tutorial helps you, and then at the very end, it gives you kind of a read that says, hey, here's historically what Millie Maker lineups are doing, and does your lineups, do they check the box? Like, are you using, if it spits it out and you have 20% of your lineups have tight ends in the flex, you need to realize like that's not going to work. So there's kind of like this extra, checkbox at the very end.
Nice little backstop, if you will.
We need it, dude. I need it after I sometimes build the lineups and I'm like, oh, I didn't even think about like setting this rule or, how I'm doing it. So that's a really cool part of the optimizer this year. Let's finish off by talking about roster percentages. The best GPP lineups kind of have a blend, and I think that's a hard thing to give a rule. It says like you have to do this, but there is some data that says if you have players under a certain percentage, it can work. So talk to me about roster percentages and what makes sense in Millie Makers.
For sure, yeah. So in these large field lottos, the bottom line is you will not climb the leaderboard unless you differentiate your lineup from everyone else that you're playing. Think about it. If everyone plays all the 10 to 20% guys, you're not going to be separating and climbing the leaderboard at a high enough rate. And you might min cash, but like, is that going to pay off in a huge way? No. So you need these, sub 5% guys that are truly difference makers to create leverage on the field. Specifically, the data has shown in these large field tournaments, under 5% guys, you need 2 of them, usually. 61% of the top quarter of lineups did this. Lineups that are missing the cash line are only doing this 54.7% of the time. So they're not doing it enough. Again, under 5% is kind of a good rule to follow. But at the same time, you also need to be willing to play some good plays, right? We talked about that. The best lineups are a combination of these good cash plays that project well with these contrarian pieces. And the cutoff from the DFS forecast guys was 18%. So lineups that use 3 players over 18% that are projecting well for a good, for a reason. The top 25% of the field was doing this about 33% of the time. And lineups that are missing the cash lineup are only doing it about a 28% time. So there's still an edge there to say, look, people, they're just not willing to play the good plays sometimes, or they're not willing to go contrarian enough sometimes. And that's really where you got to get the combination of the two.
In week 17 last year, aka the Mike Evans explosion week, if you didn't have Mike Evans, I'm sorry, that week just wasn't going to work out for you, and it didn't work out for me in a couple of championship weeks. I just got destroyed by Mike Evans in multiple leagues. But in DFS, it was kind of like he was a low play. He was at 6%, but Brady was only 3%, right? Like if you're going to play Brady, you're going to play Evans with him. It just is pretty simple. And Godwin was also a good play that week, but you look at the roster that week, there was a lot of low. There's even a tight end in the flex that week, which, like we said, it happens maybe once a year, and it was Darren Waller. But all I care about is when I look at my lineup at the very end. If I'm playing in a large field tournament, I need at least 1 to 2 players under 5%. It's really fun when you hit those. Just know you're going to be on a wild goose chase. There's a reason players are rostered that low. It's because their projections probably don't look great, or it's a game environment we don't love. Like the Buccaneers had done nothing before then to show us that they were a high-powered offense. Like they had been under their team implied total. They were a below 500 team. Like they were just not good at the very end, and then they eventually got there. But that game also didn't project great, Tampa Bay and Carolina, but it was what you needed. So I wish I could give a rule of thumb for people and just say, here's how you identify the low rostered play, but that's just part of this game, right?
I mean, the take home is just correlated, I think, most of the time. I mean, of course, it's not always the case, but I would rather use that piece of a lineup, like my contrarian plays in a stack. Because like I said, if that goes off, that's one less thing you have to get right. You're already checking the boxes on the stacking. You're checking the box on the lower roster guys. So that's kind of my preference for way of doing it. And again, the data shows the best lineups are just this combination of great plays that project well, that are going to be rostered, but also contrarian pieces. And you got to be willing to do it. You got to be willing to miss sometimes, but understand when you do hit these guys, the payoff is massive.
Yeah, and this lineup makes sense. Brady double stacked with Godwin and Evans. Somebody brought it back with DJ Moore on the Carolina side. They have Christian McCaffrey, who projected super well that week, and they correlated him with Darren Waller. They also had Travis Etienne, who was 25% in the field. So a lot of their lineup, I just went through 7 pieces that you would go, well, that makes total sense. The one that doesn't make sense is Hunter Henry at 2%. That's just random. But the goal is saying, do you have mostly good correlation? And then, you need some things to break right. You need the Saints to go for 18 points. You need all those things. Last little point, and I want you to throw out something about single entry because that is more your style. That is what you do. Any quick takes for people that, hey, I love playing tournaments, but I don't know if I want to enter the Millie Maker.
Yeah, so this is, like you said, kind of where I live in these smaller fields. And I think a good general of thumb for smaller fields, as we talk about it, is like maybe less than 1,000 people. I've heard people debate that of like, well, it's got to be less than 500 or less than 1,500 or whatever. But basically, like, just not these massive lottos is kind of where I play. And I feel like in these situations, I like to double stack. Whereas I said in these large field lottos, maybe we're single stacking more often than not. But I like to definitely double stack. I definitely like to bring back with it, because in those situations, you need to get less right. You don't need to hit 250 points to win this thing. You could win it with 200 or 180 or whatever the field sizes will dictate that. But you can get a couple things wrong and still have a very strong GPP lineup in these smaller field single entry contests. It's just very different as far as how the scoring works. You don't need the best outcomes for every player to win. So understanding that, I'm trying to correlate even more than I maybe would in a large field tournament. The other thing is that the best plays that project very well will start to get way more popular. So in the Millie Maker or whatever, if a roster percentage report is suggesting maybe 20% for this guy in a single entry tournament that's smaller field, you might be able to say, look, that's going to come in higher. I could see 28, I could see 30%. And so understanding how that, roster percentage might ebb and flow a little bit, which is sort of an art as you get used to it over time, will help you to understand where the field is going to go. And I love to be able to create massive leverage on the field in those situations because, again, more of opponents are probably going to do that. You know what they're going to do. If you flip it a little bit, you can create big time leverage and you can take a stand. So those are kind of my 2 tips for smaller field and single entry tournaments that I play in a bunch.
And we'll have more strategy articles out if you want to go on our website, thefantasyfootballers.com. We'll have GPP strategy. I'll have some of this information typed up for you guys if you just want to visualize, you want to see it. We'll also, as we do the podcast, we'll make sure that we reinforce these points every single week. One of the things we do on the Friday show every single week is we talk about our favorite 3 or 4 games to stack. So we'll give you some examples like, hey, this week, one of the ways you could do this is you could do a Geno double stack. And then my favorite bring back is this. I kind of think, in week 1, it's, they play the Rams, Cooper Kupp's going to be super popular, but what about Van Jefferson? What if he's the play this week? Or what if it's Cam Akers?
Tutu Atwell. Kyle, come on.
I don't know if I'll ever play Tutu. I'll never play Tutu. He's out of the league, basically, to me.
That was great.
So you can get all of that on the website. I do want to also give a shout out. We will have a new article this year in the DFS Pass that's called Tournament Takes by a new writer we have, Matt Hakem, who won the Millie Maker before. So he's actually gone through this process. He plays a lot of high stakes tournaments. He's done it for baseball. He's definitely done it for football. But that will be a new article that's only the DFS Pass. Somebody that won the Millie Maker and is a tournament-specific player on DraftKings. He will give his tournament takes every single week. So, yeah, DFS Pass is going to be jam-packed this year. It's going to be super fun, and we want you guys to be a part of it. Betz, tell us goodbye.
Yes, sir. Should be awesome. I'm super excited for that article. I'm excited for the DFS Pass, man. We are 2 weeks away from football. If you haven't gotten in there yet, go get the UDK Plus. It comes with the DFS Pass. DFS Pod to save at 10%. We will see you next week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at thefantasyfootballers.com.